Can you tell us
Yeah.
about the problematic nature with Gauguin and kind of how the world is, trying to grapple with the issue of the man versus the art, and how do we deal with problematic people whose work we have historically respected, but now when we put a microscope to their lives, it's really hard to appreciate the person.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, to be fair to my editor, he was basically riffing off a line that was in the audio guide to that exhibition. In the audio guide, there was a voice that said, "Is it time we stop looking at Gauguin altogether?" And so, my editor, his headline was sort of basically just taking that and rewording it, really. Is it time Gauguin got canceled? And of course, that was a rhetorical question. But as you say, Craig, I kind of got, I don't know if I got canceled, but I got in trouble, or I was criticized by certain, the French media. I mean, there were some French publications that didn't read the story. It really was very clear that they hadn't really read the story, because they, went on and on about how the New York Times was asking for Gauguin to get canceled, when in fact the story was just basically exploring the various the various new perspectives on this artist and how we should look at him today in the sort of post-Weinstein era. The reason, the conclusion that I guess I came to, having spoken to many museum directors, most of them female, and art historians and curators who know the work of Gauguin very well and have shown him on numerous occasions, is that Gauguin, he lived with, on two occasions, he married, quote unquote, according to the local Tahitian custom, two 13 or 14-year-old girls. So these were on separate occasions, obviously. And Gauguin, this is, late 19th century, early 20th, Gauguin was himself already married. He was married to a Danish woman, Mette Gauguin, and they had five children. So there were all kinds of problems with his behavior. Not only was he, technically committing an act of pedophilia, but also he was also being polygamous. I mean, there were all kinds of problems with this. And over the years, all of us have seen beautiful Gauguin exhibitions, and to this day, I love his paintings. I'm mesmerized by them. I find them beautiful, and my attraction for Gauguin's art has not diminished, even after writing this book and talking to these various people. But what these people are saying, and what these women say, is no, we're not asking for Gauguin paintings to be torn down walls and for the Musée d'Orsay to be emptied of its Gauguins, for instance. We're just saying, let's show Gauguin, but let's also talk about this personal side of him, which has been completely shunned and sort of swept under the carpet and ignored. Let's stop ignoring the personal side of Gauguin, and let's talk about Gauguin the man. That's what people are saying.
And, I feel like there's, again, sort of a comparative culture aspect to the discussion, which, you have a unique perspective on, giving, growing up in France and being in the U.S. And, it kind of plays into this, French view of cancel culture versus Americans' proclivity to that. And my wife teaches French. She lived in France for a while, and she lived in France during the Clinton impeachment. And people would come to her and say, what are you Americans? What are you even doing? Why do you care who your president sleeps with? That's not his job, right? So there seems, culturally, can you kind of speak to just a different cultural perspective of how the French are able to separate who a person is versus what a person does?
Okay, I mean, I think that that has changed a great deal, and that the stereotypes about France all need revisiting, because France is changing and changing very rapidly. When you listen to the political campaigns, they talk constantly about, like, the right-wing parties will complain about how everybody is so woke and everyone's being politically correct, and there's even a term called le wokisme. I mean, there's all these accusations flying that universities in France are just, being too politically correct, and we're paying too much attention to minorities and all of this sort of stuff. But when you actually look at what's happening, you see a great deal of shifts and a great deal of changes, and you see evolutions along the lines of what's happening in America. And here's some examples. I discovered recently that this town in Brittany where Gauguin lived, and where, there's a mural of him, on the side of a building. That mural had been covered with slogans, angry slogans by feminist groups, and that when they, wiped off the slogan, another slogan was put back on, that there's complaints about this character, and they don't want him to be associated with that town. When you look at the heads of some of the French national museums, major museums in Paris, you are seeing people who are non-white taking over. And if you look at who France has chosen to represent it at this year's Venice Biennale, where every country, as you know, most countries have a pavilion, and that pavilion is supposed to reflect the nation. Well, this year's artist is Zineb Sedira, who's French-Algerian. So, I mean, this is official France choosing Zineb Sedira, who's of Algerian descent, to represent it. So this kind of the whole issue of, and also, the issue of Me Too and women and what we heard in the very beginning of the Me Too scandal, which were a few famous voices saying, why shouldn't men have the right to flirt? I think all of that has been now revised, and you have very, very vocal young French actresses who have stood up and basically spoken of sexual assault or experiences of rape, and they have protested very, very loudly against the filmmaker Roman Polanski, and there are other examples. So I think France is changing, or has changed quite a bit.
In another part of the book, when we were talking about underrepresentation in minorities in museum staff, you referenced this term I hadn't seen before, which was universality. And, I guess, right. Which is the sense that since égalité is a cornerstone of French culture, there's no need to actually track equality. But, that doesn't seem to actually reflect opportunities for those colonial immigrant minorities. Can you tell me more about that precept? Because that's the first time I'd seen reference to that.
I mean, as you know, the French Revolution, generated this motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité, as you all know. And so the principle behind that is everybody is equal, and we were all born equal, and there's no difference between one French citizen and another. And there's also this very, very staunch tradition of secularity and secularism in France. There's a very, very, very stark separation of church and state, which means that, therefore, if everybody's equal, we can't define people according to their ethnic origin or their ethnicity, because everybody's equal. And we certainly can't define them according to their religion. So France doesn't actually, have official statistics breaking down the population according to how many are of North African origin and how many are this or that. There are, of course, those kinds of statistics, but they're more kind of informal. And so what that translates into, or what that has translated into over the decades, is that in the museum world, people were just recruited, and there was no attention paid to the fact that we also need to recruit people from, categories, minorities, or ethnicities that will make our museums more open-minded and more alert to what's going on in the real world. And, for a very long time, the French just, they just didn't pay attention to that. And whenever it was brought up, people would say, oh, yeah, that's kind of American style political correctness. And, oh, yeah, and that's just so PC. But as I was explaining to you earlier, in reality, all of that's happening quite a bit. I go to museums all the time, and I see, that the press office or this or that department actually is led by or has, people from, who have North African sounding names or who have names that don't sound like they are European French. So this is actually a process that is now in place, and that, I think that even without kind of having quotas, even without, counting people up, I think the French are really waking up to this necessity.
The conversation about underrepresentation is probably a nice segue to talk about how the environment for opportunities for African Americans is changing. I mean, I see it in terms of just seeing what museum programming looks like, what gallery programming looks like. I know that I have really struggled. I want a diverse group of guests on this podcast, and I'm having problems booking African American artists because I get lots and lots of polite responses that I'm way too busy, basically making hay while the sun is shining, right? And I guess, there is a rhetorical question that you had in the book, which is, are we witnessing a true revolution this time, an irreversible shift towards the representation of minorities in the art world? In other words, are we seeing a correction during a news cycle that when something dies down, it will go back to the old status quo? Or are we seeing a lasting change? What is your impression based on the people you've been talking to?
I mean, my impression, which I lay out in the epilogue, is that this is not a flash in the pan. It cannot be a flash in the pan. I mean, how could we, after, putting on exhibitions in major museums of major African American, let's say, artists, how could we then go back to, and doing so over a number of years? This is now a process that has started, and, in the last 3, 4, 5 years to be very, very visible. And it is very, very visible. I mean, as you know, as you were just pointing out. And how are we going to then suddenly shut the doors on African American artists, let's say, and go back to only showing Cezanne, Jackson Pollock, Gauguin, Matisse, and you know what I'm saying? I mean, and David Hockney. It's just for me, it's just inconceivable, especially since a museum such as MoMA, which is pretty much the, three-dimensional art history book, has decided to rehang its collection. And in that rehang has brought out a lot of artists who were overshadowed and overlooked for decades. Many of them women, and many of them artists who are non-white. And they're now, they're now in the MoMA rehang. And, in one of the most striking juxtapositions, Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon is hanging on a wall near Faith Ringgold's American People Number 20 Die. That's pretty striking. That's a striking vision. And that's also pretty much a kind of harbinger of what lies ahead. I mean, I really don't see MoMA, which sets the tone in so many ways, then going back to putting Faith Ringgold somewhere where she's not visible and just sticking Picasso next to Cezanne again. It's, I mean, it's just things have gone too far, I think, in a good way. Yeah, and so that's, I mean, we're on this new trajectory.
Sure. Well, I heard a conversation this past week about American professional football that it seemed to be parallel to this conversation about museums, and that in the National Football League, 80% of the players are African American, but only 3% of the teams have an African American head coach, and none of the teams have a